year.
Yeah, it's an incredibly unsettling image to start with.
Right. Just pause and try to, picture the sheer scale of that number to yourself. 500,000 people. It's a toll that is equal to, and in many years, it completely surpasses the casualties of all global armed conflicts combined.
Which is just, it's hard to fathom.
It is. But here's the thing that makes this force so unique, and honestly, it's sort of difficult to wrap your head around. It doesn't use a single bullet.
No bullets at all.
It doesn't drop any bombs. It doesn't march troops across a sovereign border.
It uses paperwork, mostly.
Exactly. Paperwork. It uses frozen assets. It uses trade blockades.
Yeah.
And you're joining us today because, you want to understand the mechanics of the world a little better.
And today we are going right to the heart of one of the most consequential but entirely invisible forces on the planet.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a statistical reality we really need to confront today.
Definitely.
We're looking at a system of international leverage that operates entirely in the open. It's debated on the floors of parliaments in the United Nations.
Right, it's public policy.
Exactly. Yet its ultimate, biological human cost has basically remained hidden in plain sight for decades.
And that brings us to the actual source material we're pulling apart today.
Yes.
We're unpacking a truly groundbreaking, peer-reviewed study that was published recently in the Lancet Global Health in 2025.
And for anyone who follows global medicine, the Lancet is essentially the gold standard.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
And the researchers behind this, Francisco Rodriguez, Silvio Rendon, and Mark Weisbrot, they took on what I can only really describe as a massive geopolitical whodunit.
That's a great way to put it.
Because they looked at the effects of international sanctions on age-specific mortality across 152 countries.
Which is just a staggering amount of data.
And they didn't just take a quick snapshot of the modern era either.
No, they analyzed a massive 50-year period.
Right, tracing the data from 1971 all the way to 2021.
And the scope of that data is really what makes this paper so unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today is to walk through how these researchers solved a puzzle that, economists have basically argued about for years.
That's been a huge debate.
Right. We're going to explore how they finally managed to prove that sanctions actually cause increased death rates.
Rather than just, happening to occur at the same time as them.
Exactly. The causation versus correlation debate. And we're going to look really closely at the demographics to see who exactly is bearing the brunt of this invisible weapon.
And perhaps most controversially, we'll examine the stark difference in the data when we look at who is actually imposing the sanctions.
Yeah, because it turns out the biological outcome for the people living in a targeted country changes radically depending on the source.
Right, like whether the sanction comes from a unilateral power like the United States or a multilateral body like the United Nations.
It's a massive difference.
Okay, so let's unpack the baseline concept first. When we hear the word sanctions on the evening news, the framing is usually pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, very clean.
We think of it as a financial timeout for misbehaving governments.
Right. A dictator violates international law, or a regime starts a rogue nuclear program.
So the international community just freezes their sovereign bank accounts and restricts their trade.
Exactly.
The narrative makes it sound incredibly clean. It sounds like this targeted, bloodless intervention.
Which is the appeal, obviously.
But this Lancet study asks us to look at what happens when that diplomatic timeout accidentally turns off the life support machine for the absolute most vulnerable people in the room.
That framing is crucial because it cuts right to the historical intent behind sanctions.
Right.
To really understand the gravity of this data, we have to look at the historical context the study provides. Mm-hmm. International sanctions are fundamentally, they're restrictions on international transactions.
They're imposed by governments or international bodies to force a change in foreign policy or domestic behavior.
Exactly. And for the last century, they've been championed by diplomats as the civilized, peaceful alternative to war.
Civilized alternative.
Right. The authors actually cite Woodrow Wilson in the paper, who was a massive proponent of this idea after the devastation of World War I.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he famously called sanctions something more tremendous than war.
More tremendous than war. That's a heavy quote.
It is. His philosophy was that you could compel a nation to change its behavior through absolute economic isolation.
Like starving the state apparatus without ever having to deploy a single soldier.
Or fire a single artillery shell.
Which, I mean, on a theoretical level, sounds infinitely preferable to trench warfare.
Of course, you want to stop a bad actor without leveling their cities.
But the sheer scale of how often this tool is deployed now is just mind-blowing.
It really is.
Like, the study pulls data from the global sanctions database, and if you look at the historical trend line, there's been an absolute explosion in the use of these financial weapons.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
Back in the 1960s, only about 8% of countries globally were dealing with some form of sanction.
Right, it was a rare, extreme measure.
But if you look at the period between 2010 and 2022, that number ballooned to 25%.
A quarter of the entire globe.
1 in 4 countries is currently under some form of sanction by the US, the EU, or the UN.
And that ubiquity is exactly why this research is so critical and, frankly, so overdue.
Because for all those decades, as the use of sanctions skyrocketed, there was this massive gaping hole in the academic discussion.
Yes. It involves what economists and statisticians call the core debate of correlation versus causation.
Right.
Now, previous public health research already knew that sanctioned countries generally had terrible health outcomes. If you looked at a spreadsheet of global health, the data was clear. When a country was sanctioned, life expectancy often dropped, infant mortality went up, disease rates climbed.
Okay, but I have to jump in here because this is where the conventional wisdom has always provided an out for the politicians imposing these policies.
Oh, absolutely.
The argument has always been, well, of course the health outcomes are terrible in those countries. Look who's running them.
You've hit on the exact blind spot the researchers were targeting.
Right.
Do the sanctions actually cause those health crises? Or do countries with failing, corrupt, or mismanaged economies simply attract sanctions because their governments are inherently unstable?
Like they're aggressive and prone to violating international norms anyway.
Exactly. The counter argument was always that if a country's economy is already collapsing due to a dictator's gross mismanagement, of course the public health infrastructure is going to suffer.
Right. The hospitals would have run out of medicine regardless of what Washington or Geneva did.
So the methodological nightmare is, how do you prove that the sanctions themselves are the legal mechanism?
And not just a side effect of bad governance.
Right.
If we think about this in everyday terms, it's the ultimate statistical chicken and egg scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if I'm walking down the street and I see a fleet of fire trucks parked outside a burning building, I don't assume the fire truck started the fire.
Right. They're responding to a disaster that was already underway.
For years, policymakers could just wave away those grim public health statistics by arguing that sanctions were essentially the fire trucks.
Showing up at countries that were already burning to the ground from internal corruption.
How on earth did these researchers prove the fire trucks were actually pouring gasoline on the flames?
Well, that specific challenge brings us to what is arguably the most impressive and rigorous part of this Lancet study.
The methodological toolkit.
Exactly. We have to remember the ethical constraints of studying macroeconomics and public health.
Yeah, you can't exactly run an experiment on an entire country.
Right. You cannot run a randomized controlled trial on a national economy. A medical researcher can take 100 patients, give 50 the real pill and 50 a placebo, and measure the difference.
But an economist cannot take 100 countries, randomly blockade the ports of 50 of them, and measure who starves.
It's ethically impossible. You have to rely entirely on observational data.
Looking at history as it naturally unfolded?
So the researchers took this massive panel of data covering 152 countries over a half century, and they applied 4 highly advanced, distinct econometric methods.
The goal was to build this statistical fortress that finally separates the pre-existing fire from the fire trucks.
Beautifully put, yes.
I really want to dig into these tools because when I read the methodology section, it felt less like a medical journal and more like a statistical heist movie.
It kind of is.
They were so incredibly clever about cornering the data. So let's walk through these 4 methods because understanding how they prove this is just as fascinating as what they found.
Let's start with the first method, which is a technique called entropy balancing.
Okay.
The easiest way to conceptualize this is that the researchers used advanced algorithms to create a parallel universe within the data.
A parallel universe. I like that.
Because when you're comparing a sanctioned country to a non-sanctioned country, you run into the problem we just discussed. They are fundamentally different places.
Right. You can't compare the mortality rate of a wealthy, peaceful, non-sanctioned country like Norway to a poor, war-torn, sanctioned country and blame the difference entirely on the sanctions.
Exactly. Entropy balancing solves this by mathematically reweighting the data to ensure that the sanction group and the control group have virtually identical observable characteristics.
So they're forcing an apples-to-apples comparison.
Yes,
They're essentially hunting through the data to find a non-sanctioned twin for every sanctioned country.
precisely.
What kind of characteristics are they balancing for? Because a country's health is affected by a million different things.
Yeah. They controlled for an incredibly wide array of macroeconomic and social variables. They looked at the logarithm of per capita income, ensuring they were comparing economies of similar size and wealth.
Makes sense.
They balanced the ratio of dependents, meaning children and the elderly, to the working age population.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They looked at the proportion of people living in rural areas versus urban centers. They even went as deep as controlling for the expected years of female schooling, which is a massive indicator of public health outcomes.
That's incredibly granular.
It is. They factored in the level of democracy or autocracy using the Polity 5 Project Index. And crucially, they controlled for whether the country was currently involved in a civil or international armed conflict.
That is wild. By reweighting all of those specific factors, they basically strip away all the usual excuses.
Exactly.
If a policymaker says, well, their mortality rate spiked because they are a poor rural autocracy in the middle of the Civil War,
the researchers can point to the entropy balancing model and say, no, we compared them against other poor rural autocracies in the middle of civil wars. We balanced the scales perfectly.
it forces you to look at two hypothetical countries that are identical in every measurable way, where the only difference is the diplomatic paperwork of the sanction.
Exactly. That's the baseline.
Okay, that is a brilliant start. What is the second tool?
The second tool relies on event study representations.
Okay.
This method is all about the timeline and the trajectory of the data. The researchers didn't just look at a single average mortality rate.
Right.
They tracked the rates dynamically over specific 3-year intervals relative to the exact moment the sanctions were imposed.
Oh, interesting.
They looked at the period before the sanctions hit, specifically years -3 to -1. Then they tracked the periods after, years 1 to 3, years 4 to 6, and year 7 and beyond.
And this timeline is the absolute smoking gun for our fire truck analogy.
It really is.
Because if the country was already burning down from terrible domestic leadership, if the economy was already in a death spiral before the diplomats ever intervened.
You'd expect to see the mortality rates climbing before the sanctions even hit.
Exactly. The graph would already be trending upward. But that's not what the Lancet data shows at all, is it?
Not at all. The study found that mortality rates were flat, statistically indistinguishable from zero change in the pre-sanctions period.
So there was no pre-existing fire in the health sector.
None. But the moment the sanctions hit, the mortality rates spiked, and they kept climbing steadily the longer the sanctions remained in place.
Wow.
The compounding cumulative effect over time that the event studies revealed is deeply alarming.
Yeah, let's look specifically at infant mortality, which is often used as the canary in the coal mine for a nation's overall public health.
Right. The study found an increase of 5.8 log points in the first 3 years following the adoption of economic sanctions.
5.8 log points.
And in years 4 to 6, that jumped to an 8.1 log point increase. And for sanctions that dragged on for 7 years or more, it reached a massive 10.0 log point increase.
I want to pause on the math for just a second because terms like log points can sound a bit abstract when we're talking about human lives.
Fair enough.
Essentially, in this specific statistical context, a log point translates very closely to a percentage increase.
Yes, roughly.
So an 8.1 log point increase is roughly equivalent to an 8% surge in the baseline mortality rate of infants, directly and uniquely attributable to the policy change.
It's a devastating surge.
When you're talking about a national population, an 8% surge in dead infants is a massive, catastrophic demographic shift.
It truly is. Which brings us to the third tool they use to lock down the causality argument, which is Granger causality tests.
Right.
I won't drag us too far into the deep statistical weeds of econometrics here.
Thank you.
But conceptually, Granger causality is a mathematical test of temporal precedence. It was developed by the Nobel laureate Clive Granger. The core idea is about predictability. If variable x causes variable y, then the past values of x should contain information that helps predict y above and beyond the information contained in past values of y alone.
Wait. Let me make sure I'm grasping the philosophy here. It's basically about proving the direction of the arrow.
Precisely the direction of the arrow.
So X to Y, not Y to X.
Right. The researchers ran these models and found that the history of sanctions significantly helped predict the future trajectory of mortality rates.
But when they ran the model in reverse,
The history of a country's mortality rates did not help predict whether they would be sanctioned.
wow.
It definitively rules out the idea of reverse causality. It mathematically proves that the imposition of the sanction is the driver of the change, not a passenger reacting to it.
And that leads us to the fourth tool. And I have to admit, when I was reading through the source material, this was the absolute standout moment for me.
It's incredibly clever.
It's genius. The fourth tool uses something called instrumental variables. And the specific instrument they chose to use is just brilliant.
It truly is a highly creative and rigorous approach to causal identification. The challenge with observational data is that there are always unobserved variables, things you can't easily measure, that might influence both the likelihood of a country being sanctioned and its mortality rate.
Right, like maybe some internal political instability that you can't quite put a number on.
Exactly. So to cut through that noise using an instrumental variable, researchers need to find a completely random external factor.
Yeah.
They need a variable that reliably triggers the implementation of unilateral sanctions, but has absolutely nothing to do with a country's internal domestic health infrastructure or economic policies.
Because if you just look at something like, say, human rights abuses as the trigger for sanctions, the data gets too messy.
Way too messy. A country committing massive human rights abuses probably already has a terrible public health system and a corrupt economy. You can't untangle the two.
You need a trigger that is totally disconnected from the daily life of the citizens inside the country. And what do these researchers use as their disconnected trigger? They used United Nations General Assembly voting records.
It's amazing. Let's explore why that specific metric works so beautifully for this model.
Yeah.
The researchers utilized a dynamic spatial model, which was originally developed by political scientists, that tracks how closely aligned different countries are in their voting patterns at the UN.
Right.
It basically maps out the ideological distance between nations based on how they vote on international resolutions.
I love this because it essentially boils geopolitics down to middle school cafeteria dynamics.
Huh. That's a fun way to think about it.
Think about it. The United States and the European Union are the popular kids at a very specific table. They are highly, highly unlikely to unilaterally sanction their friends.
Right. The countries who sit at their table and vote with them consistently at the UN General Assembly.
Exactly. If they do decide to sanction a friend, it is usually because that friend did something so universally egregious, like invading a neighbor, that the entire cafeteria agrees they need a timeout.
And in that case, the sanction is multilateral. It comes from the whole UN Security Council.
But if a sanction is unilateral, meaning just the US or just the EU deciding to punish someone on their own, it is almost exclusively directed at the kids sitting at the opposing tables, the countries that vote against them.
Your analogy captures the geopolitical reality perfectly.
Thanks.
And bringing it back to the statistical model, it means the researchers found a brilliant backdoor.
Right.
By simply measuring the voting distance, the mathematical ideological gap at the UN between a target country and the United States or the European Union, the researchers could accurately predict the likelihood of unilateral sanctions being imposed on that country.
And here is the crucial part.
Yes.
A country's foreign policy voting record in a diplomatic building in New York has absolutely no direct biological mechanism to influence its own domestic neonatal mortality rates back home.
Exactly. A diplomat raising their hand to vote against a U.S. resolution doesn't cause a hospital in their home country to suddenly run out of antibiotics. Therefore, this voting distance serves as a perfectly clean instrument. It correlates strongly with the imposition of sanctions, but it is completely uncorrelated with domestic health variables.
So it isolates the exact pure impact of the sanction itself.
Stripping away all the domestic economic noise.
It is a phenomenal way to prove causality. You look at how they vote, you use that to predict the sanction, and you measure the resulting death rate.
No domestic economic variables muddying the waters.
So when you combine entropy balancing to create identical countries, event studies to prove the timeline, Granger causality to prove the direction of the arrow, and UN voting instruments to isolate the trigger.
The researchers built an ironclad, multi-layered case.
The debate is over. Sanctions cause mortality. The fire trucks are actively fueling the fire.
The methodological rigor of this paper is exactly what forces us to confront the reality of its findings. The authors have effectively closed and locked the door on the correlation argument. which means the international community can no longer hide behind statistical ambiguity.
We now have to look clearly, without any excuses, at the human cost.
We have to look at the anatomy of the toll.
And the numbers they arrive at are just staggering. Once the researchers built these models and proved causation, they calculated the specific coefficients for global, economic, and unilateral sanctions.
Right, and they then applied those mathematical models to real-world demographic data from the UN Population Division to calculate the actual body count.
And the ultimate calculation they present is chilling. Between 2012 and 2021, unilateral sanctions caused an estimated 564,258 deaths per year.
Let that number really sink in for a moment.
Yeah.
Over 500,000 lives extinguished annually as a direct result of economic policy. The study notes that this corresponds to roughly 3.6% of all deaths observed in sanctioned countries.
It's a massive, unnatural distortion of global mortality.
It is.
To put that in perspective for anyone listening, we need to compare it to the things we usually think of as the primary drivers of unnatural death globally.
War, mostly.
Right? The study points out that the average annual number of battle-related casualties worldwide during the same 10-year period was about 106,000 deaths per year.
So roughly a fifth of the deaths caused by sanctions.
Even if you look at the absolute most horrific years of recent conflicts, like the height of the Syrian civil war or the crisis in Yemen, and you take the absolute highest estimates of total war deaths, including civilians, it generally caps out at around 500,000.
Which means what this data is telling us is that economic sanctions are killing as many, if not more, people than actual literal kinetic warfare.
That's horrifying.
And this is where the study's decision to break down the data by age-specific mortality becomes so crucial and so devastating.
Yeah.
They didn't just look at a lump sum of excess deaths and leave it at that. They categorized the mortality data into 7 distinct age groups.
Newborns, infants, children under 5, older children, adolescents, working age adults up to age 60, and older people age 60 to 80.
Right. And this is where the reality of this policy gets incredibly dark.
Because when you look at who is making up that 500,000 annual body count, it isn't the people making the decisions.
It's not the soldiers in the target country's army.
It isn't the government officials or the oligarchs who actually triggered the sanctions.
Not at all.
The most shocking finding in the entire paper is this. 51% of all deaths caused by sanctions between 1970 and 2021 were children under 5 years old.
The data on early childhood mortality is undeniable. The under 5 mortality effect showed an 8.4 log point increase. They are by far the most profoundly affected demographic.
I mean, wait, toddlers.
Yes, primarily toddlers and infants.
Right.
And when you look at the other end of the demographic spectrum, the secondary spike in mortality occurs among the elderly.
Oh, wow.
Individuals aged 60 to 80 saw a 2.4 log point increase.
I have to challenge the overarching logic of this entire system from a basic policy standpoint.
Go for it.
Politicians go on television and champion these sanctions as targeted precision tools. They say the stated goal is to pressure a government's leadership, to defund a rogue military, or to squeeze the elite billionaires supporting a dictator.
That's always the rhetoric.
But the Lancet data shows that over 3/4 of the people actually dying are children under 15 and adults over 60. Together, they make up 77% of the victims.
Yes.
We're talking about populations that aren't even in the labor force. They certainly aren't serving in the military. And they are making geopolitical decisions in the capital.
No.
How can a policy be considered targeted if 77% of the casualties are toddlers and grandparents?
You're highlighting the massive disconnect between diplomatic rhetoric and epidemiological reality.
It's hard to reconcile.
And it raises an absolutely critical question, perhaps the most important question of our entire discussion. How?
Right. By what exact physical mechanism does a policy document signed in a pristine diplomatic office in Washington, Brussels, or Geneva translate into the death of a toddler or an elderly person thousands of miles away?
Exactly. How do macroeconomic restrictions transform into a biological crisis within a human body?
Because a piece of paper doesn't stop a heart from beating. A frozen bank account doesn't directly cause a fever.
No.
We need to trace the mechanism of mortality. How does the financial tourniquet actually kill a patient?
Well, the Lancet article does not leave this to the imagination. It outlines 3 specific interconnected pathways that translate these macroeconomic shocks into a devastating public health crisis on the ground.
Let's walk through them in detail because the mechanics are vital to understand.
Pathway 1 is plunging public revenues.
Okay.
When comprehensive economic sanctions hit a country, they immediately crush the central government's ability to generate income. Exports are blocked, international business grinds to a halt, corporate profits collapse.
And as a result, the national tax base shrinks dramatically.
Exactly. And when a government's wallet is suddenly empty, when the treasury is bare, the first thing to get slashed in a developing economy is usually the public sector.
That is the tragic reality. This plunge in revenue inevitably leads to massive, sweeping cuts in the quantity and quality of public health provision.
Imagine a national healthcare system that suddenly loses 40% of its funding overnight.
It would be chaos.
State-funded hospitals can no longer afford to maintain their equipment. Rural health clinics are forced to close their doors entirely because they simply can't keep the lights on or pay for diesel for their generators.
Doctors, nurses, and medical staff go unpaid for months on end.
Eventually, out of sheer desperation, those medical professionals have to leave the country or leave the profession entirely, just to find a way to feed their own families.
The basic infrastructure of public health simply hollows out from within.
Yes, okay, so I can visualize that. The state runs out of money, so the hospitals decay.
Right.
But pathway 2 is where the international element of sanctions really bites, and where the isolation becomes lethal.
Pathway 2 is the foreign exchange drought.
And I think this is a concept that is often misunderstood.
Definitely.
To put this in everyday terms, countries don't just buy things with their own local currency on the global market.
No, they don't.
If a hospital in a sanctioned country wants to buy advanced medical scanners from Germany, or life-saving oncology drugs from Switzerland, or even just basic wheat imports to feed its population, they can't pay in their local, often hyperinflating currency.
Right. The global market demands foreign currency. Usually they need US dollars or euros.
That is the foundation of global trade. And countries typically earn that crucial foreign exchange by exporting goods, selling oil, minerals, agriculture, or manufactured products to the rest of the world.
But sanctions freeze a country's ability to export. Furthermore, they often freeze whatever foreign reserves the country's central bank already holds in overseas accounts.
Oh, wow. So a sanctioned country might actually possess massive wealth on paper. They might have billions of dollars worth of oil under the ground or vast agricultural resources sitting within their borders, but they are completely locked out of the global marketplace.
Without access to that foreign exchange, the country literally cannot participate in international commerce.
Exactly.
It's not just that the local hospitals are underfunded. It's that the actual physical medicine, the insulin, the antibiotics, the anesthesia, the water purification chemicals cannot be purchased and brought across the border.
They are financially starved of the basic materials manufactured abroad that are needed to sustain life.
And this leads directly into Pathway 3.
Which is perhaps the most frustrating and tragic aspect for those working in global humanitarian health.
Yeah.
Pathway 3 is the chilling effect on humanitarian aid and the phenomenon of overcompliance.
Overcompliance, right.
Now, if you listen to policymakers defend these sanctions, they will almost always argue that the regimes are designed with strict humanitarian exemptions.
Oh, I hear that all the time.
They will publicly state, we are not targeting the people. We are not blocking food or medicine. Those items are explicitly exempt from our sanctions.
But anyone who has ever spoken to an NGO working in these regions knows the reality on the ground is entirely different from the rhetoric.
It is entirely different. The study highlights that even when these humanitarian exemptions exist clearly on paper, they create insurmountable, perceived, or real barriers in the global financial system.
How so?
The legal frameworks of these sanctions are incredibly complex, labyrinthine documents, and the financial penalties for violating them, even accidentally, are astronomical.
We're talking about global banks facing multi-billion-dollar fines from the US Treasury or European regulators if they process a transaction that touches a sanctioned entity.
Right. I've read about this phenomenon of overcompliance. It is essentially when international banks look at the risk to reward ratio and just decide to completely de-risk.
Yes, exactly.
They refuse to process any transaction involving the sanctioned country, even if it is a perfectly legal, fully documented purchase of medicine by a recognized international charity.
The compliance officers at the bank look at the risk of a $2 billion fine and they say, it is absolutely not worth our time or risk to process a $50,000 wire transfer for a medical NGO.
And the result is paralysis. Non-governmental organizations, humanitarian groups, and even neutral medical suppliers become terrified of accidentally violating these laws.
Or even if an NGO is brave enough to try and operate, they simply cannot find a correspondent bank anywhere in the world willing to hold their funds or process their international transfers.
Their ability to deliver emergency aid is entirely crippled not by a physical blockade of ships, but by an administrative and legal chilling effect in the banking sector.
It really brings us back to the idea of a massive financial tourniquet.
It's a great analogy.
The intention of the policymakers might genuinely be to just cut off the blood flow to the disease, to starve the bad actors, the military leaders, or the corrupt politicians in the targeted government.
But you can't apply a tourniquet to a single vein in a national economy.
Right. The tourniquet is applied to the country's entire neck.
Yeah.
And when you restrict the flow of resources that severely, the parts of the body politic that need the most oxygen, the sick, the young, the elderly, the people who rely entirely on state-subsidized healthcare and imported medicine, they are the very first to suffocate.
That is a stark analogy, but it perfectly encapsulates the biological reality described in the data. The macro-level restrictions inevitably pool at the bottom of the demographic pyramid.
But as the researchers dug deeper into the numbers, as they parsed out the different types of sanctions, they found a massive, undeniable twist in the data.
Because it turns out not all tourniquets are the same.
Right. The source of the sanctions, who is actually applying the pressure and how they are doing it, radically changes whether the people in the targeted country live or die.
Which brings us to a fascinating and deeply polarizing part of this deep dive. The sender's fingerprint.
And I want to frame this carefully before we get into the data.
Please do.
Because it is very easy to get caught up in the traditional political talking points here, to fall into left-wing or right-wing debates about American hegemony versus globalism.
Definitely.
I want to be incredibly clear to you, the listener. We aren't taking a political side here on right-wing or left-wing foreign policy or judging the merits of the U.S. versus the UN. We are strictly looking at the biological and statistical reality presented in the Lancet data.
Exactly. What is so striking about this Lancet paper is how it bypasses the politics entirely. It just looks at the raw demographic math.
It evaluates the biological footprint left behind by different geopolitical entities. And the divergence in the data is shocking.
It is a remarkable divergence. The researchers conducted what statisticians call a nested specification analysis.
Okay, let's break that down.
To visualize this, imagine a statistical cage match. They took all the different categories of sanctions, unilateral sanctions imposed by one country, multilateral sanctions imposed by groups, purely economic sanctions, non-economic travel bans, sanctions imposed specifically by the US, by the EU, and by the UN.
Okay, that's a lot of category.
They put all of these variables into a single complex regression model at the same time. The goal was to see which specific types of sanctions were actually driving the death rates, conditional on the presence of the others.
When you throw them all into the mix and force them to compete to explain the mortality spikes, a very stark divide appears immediately.
The deadly drivers became overwhelmingly clear. Unilateral sanctions, meaning those imposed by a single country or a specific bloc, rather than the broader international community and comprehensive economic sanctions, were the absolute primary drivers of mortality.
But when the researchers zoomed in even further to identify the specific source,
U.S. unilateral sanctions were significantly and uniquely associated with increased mortality across almost all age groups. In the statistical models, the American financial footprint dominated the mortality outcomes.
And then there is the counter-finding, the UN anomaly.
Right.
When the researchers looked at United Nations sanctions, multilateral sanctions agreed upon by the global community through the Security Council, they found no statistically significant effect on mortality.
No effect.
Let me repeat that, because it feels counterintuitive. In their statistical cage match, U.S. unilateral sanctions spiked the death tolls dramatically, but UN sanctions did not.
In fact, in some of the model specifications, the coefficients for UN sanctions even trended negative.
Meaning they might have slightly correlated with lower mortality.
Though the researchers are careful to note that wasn't statistically significant, regardless, the difference between the two is night and day.
It is a profound discrepancy. And what is truly fascinating is trying to understand the mechanics behind it. Why does an embargo imposed from Washington kill hundreds, thousands of people, while an embargo imposed from New York does not?
The study offers 3 highly compelling theories for why UN sanctions don't leave the same lethal footprint as US unilateral sanctions.
Let's explore those theories. Because if the goal is to stop a nation from trading, why does the source matter so much to a hospital patient? What is the first theory?
The first theory centers on public scrutiny and institutional design. The United Nations is, by its very nature, a deliberative global body. Crucially, the UN General Assembly and the Security Council include the target countries themselves, or at least their regional allies.
Oh, right.
When the UN debates imposing sanctions, the decisions are highly publicized and fiercely scrutinized by multiple opposing factions. Because of this structural transparency and the necessity of building broad international consensus, UN sanctions are generally framed, debated, and designed specifically to minimize civilian harm.
There are simply more diverse voices at the table, demanding that humanitarian exemptions are practical and functional, not just theoretical.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. It is a compromise by committee. If you need Russia, China, the US, and France to all agree on a punishment, the sharpest, most devastating edges of that punishment are going to get sanded down during the negotiations.
Yeah.
The resulting policy is much more targeted.
Precisely. What is the second theory?
The second theory is darker, and it relates to design and intent. The study points out a very uncomfortable reality regarding the strategic goals of unilateral actors.
Uncomfortable how?
As cited by the authors, U.S. sanctions often explicitly or implicitly aim for regime change. And achieving regime change from the outside often relies on the intentional systemic deterioration of living conditions within the target country.
The strategic theory is that if you make life miserable enough for the average citizen, if they can't afford bread or find medicine, they will eventually rise up and overthrow their government. In these specific strategic playbooks, the economic pain of the civilian population isn't an accidental side effect. It is the primary intended mechanism of pressure.
If you step back and look at that strategy, it perfectly explains the data. If your explicit geopolitical goal is to create true, widespread desperation to spark a revolt, then you have to restrict the resources necessary for survival.
Which translates directly to the spikes in infant and elderly mortality we are seeing in the Lancet models. It is a chilling strategic calculus.
It really is. And the third theory explains the sheer mechanical capability to execute that strategy.
Right.
The third theory is about global power and currency dominance. The United States, and to a lesser extent the European Union, control the global reserve currencies, the dollar and the euro.
And the vast majority of all global trade, international banking, and cross-border transactions are settled in these currencies and cleared through financial institutions based in these jurisdictions.
I think this is the piece of the puzzle people miss the most. If the U.S. sanctions a country, they aren't just saying you can no longer trade with America.
No.
Because of the dominance of the dollar, they're essentially saying you can no longer trade with almost anyone, anywhere.
Exactly. And the U.S. leverages this unparalleled financial dominance through what is called extraterritorial application, or secondary sanctions.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
That means the U.S. Treasury doesn't just forbid American companies from trading with the targeted country. They declare that if any company in any country in the world tries to trade with the target, the U.S. will cut that third-party company entirely out of the U.S. financial system.
Wow.
It forces the entire globe to enforce the American blockade out of sheer self-preservation.
Because no bank can survive without access to U.S. dollars.
Right. The United Nations, despite its global political mandate, simply does not possess that kind of unilateral, absolute financial chokehold over the global banking system.
So the data is reflecting a structural reality of the modern world. When the United States leverages its massive, unparalleled control over global banking to impose comprehensive, unilateral economic sanctions, the tourniquet is pulled incredibly tight.
It restricts global resource flows in a way that multilateral, consensus-driven UN sanctions simply do not replicate.
And this objective, data-driven look at the mechanics of sanctions forces a deeply uncomfortable policy dilemma, a dilemma that the authors of the study raise very pointedly in their conclusion.
If we accept the causal proof, what is the ethical path forward?
This brings us to the ethical crossroads. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the brilliant methodology, the historical context, the economic mechanics. But at the end of the day, we are talking about 500,000 human lives extinguished every single year.
It's heavy.
The authors pose a profound question. If we now have rigorous causal proof that unilateral and economic sanctions kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, annually matching the literal death toll of wars, how can the international community justify their continued use?
The study suggests we have to evaluate this through two distinct ethical frameworks. The first is a rights-based perspective. From this point of view, the argument is stark and straightforward. If a policy violates the fundamental human right to life on this massive scale, it should simply be suspended. Full stop.
You cannot justify the deaths of hundreds of thousands of toddlers under the guise of diplomatic leverage or geopolitical strategy.
Under a rights-based framework, the action is inherently immoral, regardless of the intended outcome.
But if we're being realistic about how international relations actually operate, policymakers rarely operate purely on a rights-based framework. They operate on the second framework, right? The weighing of costs and benefits.
Yes, the consequentialist perspective. This is the classic argument of whether the ends justify the means.
Right.
Do the political outcomes of these sanctions, stopping a rogue nuclear program, punishing a dictator for human rights abuses, forcing democratic elections, do those outcomes justify the human cost?
But the authors point out that this evidence of mass mortality must now be heavily weighed against whether sanctions actually achieve those political goals.
And there is an intense, decades-long debate in political science over whether sanctions actually work in changing regime behavior at all.
Yeah, many studies suggest they frequently fail, or even entrench authoritarian leaders who use the sanctions to rally nationalist sentiment.
If the sanctions don't consistently achieve their political goals, and we now know they unequivocally kill 500,000 people a year, the consequentialist argument for using them collapses entirely.
The study isn't just throwing its hands up in despair, though. It is serving as a massive empirical catalyst for change. The authors note that these findings add critical, undeniable fuel to the fire for international initiatives that are pushing to radically redesign economic statecraft.
Absolutely. The data is arming reformers. There are growing demands for mandatory, independent humanitarian impact assessments before any broad sanctions are imposed.
There are calls for immense restraint in the use of unilateral blockades and demands for the creation of alternative financial clearinghouses that ensure humanitarian exemptions are not just legal fictions, but practical, functional realities for banks and NGOs operating on the ground.
It really brings us full circle to that Woodrow Wilson quote from the beginning of our deep dive.
He championed sanctions as something more tremendous than war.
And for a century, the international community has patted itself on the back, treating economic sanctions as the civilized, bloodless alternative to dropping bombs.
But this Lancet data asks us a devastating question. If the body count is exactly the same, and the victims are overwhelmingly toddlers and grandparents who have absolutely nothing to do with the conflict, is it really an alternative to war? Or is it just a quieter, more bureaucratic way to wage it?
That tension is the synthesis of everything we've unpacked today. We started with a long-held but unproven hunch in the public health community about the devastating impacts of sanctions.
We walked through the rigorous, undeniable statistical proof of causation, the brilliance of entropy balancing, the timeline of the event studies, and the geopolitical mapping of the UN voting instruments.
We uncovered the staggering, quantifiable annual toll of 560,000 lives. We mapped out the biological mechanisms of financial starvation, from plunging hospital revenues to the freezing of foreign exchange and the terror of banking overcompliance.
And finally, we discovered the stark, undeniable difference between the lethal impact of U.S. unilateral sanctions and the relatively benign footprint of UN multilateral actions.
It is an immense amount of complex information to take in, but once you understand the mechanics, it changes the way you view the global news cycle entirely.
It really does. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. The next time you open your phone and read a breaking news headline about a country being slapped with tough new economic sanctions to punish a dictator, I want you to look past the political theater.
Look past the podiums and the press conferences.
Ask yourself, in a hyper-globalized economy, where digital money is the literal physical lifeblood of healthcare, sanitation, and food distribution, who's actually going to pay the ultimate price for that policy tomorrow morning?
Is the global financial system simply too interconnected, too vital to basic human survival for a targeted economic weapon to ever truly exist?
A vital question that will define the future of international relations. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible mechanisms of global power. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus.